It's no surprise that periods of time often become associated with the byproducts of the time in question, which means it's very fair to claim that early computer gaming was largely defined by the adventure game. Text or point and click, these often sprawling adventures delivered narratives and character development in a way that really few other genres could at the time. When they truly hit their stride, they featured grand landscapes, atmospheric soundtracks, and occasionally maddening inventory management and puzzle solving, melding immersion and thought-provoking, if somewhat slower and less flashy, gameplay in what was most certainly a happy marriage. Works by the likes of Roberta Williams and LucasArts have been revered as classics in the years since their release, but no matter where one looked, there was no shortage of adventure game goodness to be savored throughout the 90s. Like anything else, however, the genre had started to fall out of favor in the gaming world by the dawn of the new millennium. More than anything, this probably had something to do with the inevitable march of technology. As what games could be changed, so too did people's expectations and interests. Be honest, if you were a kid glued to the screen of a CRT in the 90s, would you rather find adventure in interfaces and dialogue, or something like Tomb Raider? In some ways, it's not unlike what happened with Resident Evil. The fixed camera angles were great for the time, and promptly dumped as soon as technology had advanced to a point as to allow for a more fast-paced, engaging experience. Now, whether or not that's a good or bad thing is undoubtedly up to the individual, but the reality of trends remains a constant throughout history, which is what makes the Blackwell Legacy and the entire Blackwell series in general such an oddity. The first game in question came out in 2006, meaning that it was about as in fashion for its time as sporting a perm today would be. It just simply wasn't a time when adventure games were being made, which is precisely why someone like myself, who was growing up in those days, doesn't really have much of a connection to the genre as a whole. I missed the adventure game heyday, so to speak, and only became acquainted with them through the internet later. At the helm was Wadjet Eye Games, I can't even say that, nowadays known for quite a few adventure games, with Legacy being their first ever title. The debut sees the player take the role of Rosangela Blackwell, a fledgling writer who somehow affords a New York apartment on her own on a freelancer's salary. The story opens with her saying goodbye to her aunt, who had spent the last several years of her life confined to a mental facility. But the world keeps turning, and before long she's tasked with writing a story about the apparent suicide of an NYU student. This thrusts you into the role of an amateur sleuth, looking around and asking the necessary, hard-hitting questions to find the answers you need. Also, a ghost from the 1930s of a guy named Joey Malone starts following you around. What? You didn't see that coming? See, Rosangela here comes from a family of mediums, being able to talk to the dead, with the game taking place once it's her turn to take up the mantle. She's understandably apprehensive at first, mainly because this is all explained to her by a floating ghost from the Prohibition era. But when some other college students wind up dead, she and her new ethereal partner set out to lay their souls to rest. The game plays like most any other adventure game. You walk through environments, clicking on everything in sight on the long-shot premise that they might contain some small figment of useful information. When the teddy bear won't talk, you hope that the people themselves will, asking a litany of questions in a way that stops barely short of interrogation to piece together the clues of your quest. While you do collect items along your journey, Legacy is pretty different from its contemporaries in the sense that there aren't many inventory object puzzles to be found. Rather, these items serve more to grant clues and fill in the backstory, helping you connect the dots to leads. Rosangela, being a journalist, frequently refers to notes to base her questions off of and draw connections between associated parties. If I can, for a moment, just espouse my love for this premise. It's not an uncommon trope in adventure and mystery titles for a novelist to be thrust into the role of an amateur sleuth. It's the basis of something like Gabriel Knight's Sins of the Fathers, and hell, let Murder, She Wrote run for over a decade, with the immortal Angela Lansbury arguably defining the role. But I've always felt like a journalist, considering the nature of the work in question often requires at least some investigation, filling such a role makes more sense. The premise of asking questions and looking for connections for the purpose of drawing conclusions from a haphazard, skinny sheet of notes is pretty realistic. And I can speak to that realism because by the time this video is released, or very close to it, I will have earned an accreditation in communications with a focus in journalism. Granted, we're more liable to record audio on our phones in 2023, but the idea is the same. While a journalist certainly isn't a detective, there is some overlap in the need to be able to pick up on unspoken details, whether it be in the environment or the way people act. The logic-based gameplay found in Legacy is very representative of that fact. Unraveling the story itself is the puzzle, rather than being faced with a series of insular hurdles that have to be overcome in order to proceed. You can only ask questions based on what you know and what you've been told, meaning you've got to snoop as best you can and put in the time to do your own research. Of course, most journalists aren't dealing with the paranormal, nor do we have a ghost with whom we can converse to sort through things, but, we get by. This style means the game plays a bit more like a visual novel. Oftentimes, where you need to go is pretty obvious. The challenge lies in figuring out how to get there, and I will make zero apologies about the fact that this is my preferred style of adventure game. Maybe it has something to do with not growing up with these games, but I've been pretty clear in the past about the zero tolerance I have for some of the nonsensical puzzles and plot points in older point-and-click titles. Is what's on offer in Legacy as difficult as a lot of other adventure games? No, I wouldn't say so, but I don't think it's made any worse because of it, because there is a challenge here. It's just presented in a way that more so tests your ability to keep clues and facts in order, as opposed to strict problem solving. It's because there isn't a focus on making sure there's a puzzle every 3 feet that the game has ample opportunity to spend time elsewhere. You get to learn about Rosangela and her family, and there's more than a few optional conversations that can only be seen depending on when you go where and how you explore each location. The chemistry between the two protagonists really carries the game in a lot of respects. Rosangela and Joey work very naturally off one another, with Rosangela playing the straight man and Joey bringing the comic relief, and it is sincerely fun to see them interact. In some ways, it's reminiscent of the relationship with Joey in Beneath a Steel Sky, to the point that I have to question if it's intentional. Across the board, the voice acting is really well done, an aspect that unquestionably takes on a greater importance in a game like this. Joey is voiced by Abe Goldfarb, who has since gone on to perform in games like Unavowed and Pathfinder Kingmaker, and Rebecca Whitaker, the voice of Rosangela, does an impeccable job bringing out the intelligent, somewhat socially awkward aspects of the character. Doubly so considering that outside of one other game, this is basically her only role ever. The environment, too, is a treat to take in. A lot of adventure games are rooted in the 90s, historical, or completely fantastical settings, so taking the chance to navigate through a mid-2000s New York is a welcomingly unique experience. It even perfectly captures the contempt that has basically become the city's brand. If the game has any issues, it's that on a technical level, it leaves a lot to be desired. Any modern system is going to want to upscale it, which has the unfortunate side effect of making a lot of the text hard to read, and while the performances themselves might be good, Goldfarb is liable to blow out your eardrums with the $15 Best Buy mic that he definitely recorded his lines with. In fact, he's probably the only character that doesn't get drowned out by the typically overly loud music. As for the music itself, I don't think the tracks are bad, they're just very 2000s in all the worst ways, and they didn't always fit the backdrops they were put against, usually being a bit too energetic for the given setting. There is a sort of tangible inconsistency in tone. This is a pretty dark game, with the aspect of death being a constant in the storyline, and there is definitely a lack of deference to some of these heavier themes at times, especially from Joey. I didn't personally have a problem with it, but I could see why some people would, whether it be because of their own opinions as to how these themes should be tackled, or the resulting whiplash that comes from what's being discussed and how it's presented. And while it's not necessarily a problem, I should note that the game is really short. Like, finish in a single sitting short. It makes the fact that there's a days mechanic kind of weird, because nothing meaningfully changes based on the day, at least not as far as I could tell. Mindful of some of these problems, it's still a fun experience. The story is certainly interesting enough to keep you playing, it looks great with a lot of detail evident in the environments and especially these headshots for each character, and gives you plenty to do while almost entirely avoiding what I believe are some of the pitfalls common to the genre. What makes the Blackwell Legacy so interesting is a lot of what I talked about in the beginning, that 2006 definitely wasn't a time in which honest-to-goodness adventure games were being made, and I think the quality on display here, despite being a smaller indie title, is proof that just because something falls out of popularity in the court of public opinion doesn't mean that it isn't still good. It's just not what people might be into at a given time. I think it would be fun to take a look at the other games in this series in the future, particularly the last few, because those games started to release after the point-and-click genre had started to experience a sort of renaissance in the 2010s. Examining how they may have been affected by that return in popularity could be interesting. For now, though, I would say that the Blackwell Legacy is worth the time. And hey, whatever. Considering you're like a proper game studio now, maybe look into a remaster for this one to try and fix some of those technical issues. The game is good enough that it deserves it.